What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you my review after 100% for Warhammer 40k Mechanicus. A TRPG, of course, set in the Warhammer 40k universe, but specifically taking control of a portion of the Adeptus Mechanicus. But before we dive into all that, just to get my usual stuff out of the way, I review games after 100% all the time to set me apart from other reviewers on the platform, and while that does include the achievements, it also includes a lot more than that. If you're curious about everything it entails, you can go to my channel. If you're not subscribed, in the first video you'll see is a video explaining everything that I cover. Moreover, my Steam profile is public and linked in the description below. Feel free to check it out. But with no further ado, let's jump into this thing. Now, as I mentioned, Mechanicus is a TRPG, which involves a lot of tactical turn-based combat, as you might imagine, which sees us battling Necrons with, of course, units and troops from the Adeptus Mechanicus. Which brings me to my primary reason for checking the game out, as it originally released in 2018, which is to learn a little bit more about Warhammer 40k. And on that note, most of what you're going to learn here is, of course, about the Tech Priests of Mars, the Adeptus Mechanicus, as well as the Necrons themselves, as that's pretty much all we see, because Mechanicus is a very focused experience, which in a lot of ways I think helps it out, but it's not terribly long. A first playthrough, you're probably looking at maybe 15 to 20 hours, though there is a little bit of replayability to it, which is good because it's often regarded as one of the better Warhammer 40k games. But the first thing I want to talk about with this title is actually the difficulty itself, because there are a ton of difficulty options. There are the presets, of course, that you would expect, and the game tells you exactly what changes here, but in addition to those things, there are also a ton of customizable options, so you're guaranteed to find something that suits you here. And the game's even kind enough to tell you which of these will affect achievements, which won't. And I think it's important to mess around with these difficulty settings and find something you're comfortable with, because the other part of difficulty that I wanted to speak about was that this game is primarily only challenging in the beginning, because once you start hitting a good pace of progression, most of the difficulty evaporates. Because while the initial experience is very challenging because you don't really have any unlocks or units, once you start getting those things, a lot of missions can sort of just be walked through. So if any of that matters to you, you can adjust all sorts of various things with all of these difficulty options to hopefully find some manner of challenge for you. But I would also say this is a great TRPG for beginners because you have all these options, and the game is relatively focused and small in scope. That makes it pretty easy to learn at the same time, as there's not a ton of mechanics to wrap your head around, and it's not overly complicated by any means, which makes a game for a TRPG veteran that is pretty straightforward to complete, while at the same time being a pretty good experience for reasons we'll get into mostly in the combat section, because next up I want to talk a little bit about the story. So the story for this one is relatively minor. There's not a lot of story here, but most of it is that you receive a transmission from someone thought long gone. You follow that transmission to a planet upon which Necrons start awakening, and you want to gather as much information and put a stop to this before your timer runs out, which means the story is basically just trying to keep the Necrons from getting out of hand. But even still, there are a few things about the story I want to mention. For starters, there's actually a few different endings, which comes down to which missions you actually do, because as most TRPGs do, this uses a mission structure, but which missions you are undertaking matters. You may or may not get to do all of them depending on how well you do, because as you move through missions, you'll gain awakening levels. These levels are added as 1 percentage point per level to your awakening meter. Once this meter reaches 100, you're forced to the end game, which is to fight the last boss, who's honestly not particularly difficult, but more on that in a second. So depending on how well you tackle all these various missions, you might be able to complete the game without ever actually reaching 100% awakening. And around 40 to 50%, regardless of your progress, the last fight will open up and you can undertake it whenever you're ready. But each individual mission will see you moving from room to room in a sort of randomly generated map. These maps will have various events. One of the options in the settings will actually show you which of these narrative events will give you what benefit. So you're not completely in the dark here, but you'll navigate narrative events, battles, and things in these rooms, but moving from room to room will increase your alert level. So will rounds in combat. However, it can also be reduced by destroying the consoles you find in combat, and just being effective to not let it get up too quickly to begin with will prevent you from reaching very high awakening levels. And if you're being very efficient, you can definitely do everything without actually hitting 100% awakening. In order to complete each mission, you'll have to undertake a few required battles. Each mission has a rating, easy, normal, or hard, which basically means 1, 2, or 3 required battles. This is important because your characters can't heal or anything in between these fights, outside of just their regular abilities, and this is in addition to any optional fights you choose to partake in. But we're not done there in terms of the mission structure and whatnot. From our sort of management screen, who you are taking the mission from matters. There are several leaders of this Mechanicus unit, all of which will send you on various missions, which will give a small narrative to what you are actually doing. And while the narrative is relatively minor, as these missions are still basically all the same after a little while, it's important to know which leader you're doing missions for, as each individual leader will give you various rewards, which leads into progression, which we're about to talk about. But also, how you get the other endings for the game is completing all of the missions for one or the other of the top 2 leaders. You can do all of their missions in a playthrough, that is to say both of them. However, whichever one of them's missions you complete first will give you the ending for that leader. If you don't finish either of their quest lines, you'll get a sort of neutral ending. And one of the leaders as well specifically gives out DLC missions for the Heretic DLC that they put out, which involves fighting some cultists on your own Mechanicus ship as they take over parts of it, which will give you some more unique encounters with some different enemies to fight. And in fact, the most difficult fight in the game, really, in my opinion, is the final boss for the DLC. And in general, the DLC missions are more difficult than the regular missions. So I wouldn't tackle the missions from that guy too early, or you might run into some problems. But that does bring me to my last point before we start talking about progression, and that is that you can fail missions. You can fail almost all of them, actually. However, this will result in lost rewards, so whatever reward you're expecting to get will no longer be available. And in general, it's pretty bad on your awakening level, but failing a mission is not that big of a deal. You can fail a ton of them and still absolutely finish the game, as the only missions that are particularly important to actually succeed in are defeating the bosses of each sector. The planet and the missions you are undertaking all take place in various sectors. When you do enough missions in individual sectors, you'll eventually unlock the boss for that area, which will lead to a unique boss fight. If you kill the bosses here in these boss fights, you'll be better off, because any boss fight that you do not win here, or just don't actually unlock and fight them, will show up in the final boss fight as a prelude to it. So any of these bosses you don't take out before the final fight, you'll have to fight at the same time before you fight the final boss. That said though, a lot of these boss fights are easier than the regular missions, so not really a huge deal either. But now let's talk a little bit about progression. As I mentioned earlier, one of the main things that we get from mission rewards is actually progression-based stuff. So for starters, we get a resource called Blackstone, which is used for a lot of different things, but also we can unlock more troop types, extra cognition, and extra tech priests. So when it comes to progression, first thing to know is that succeeding in missions and getting those rewards is pretty important, even though you can fail. So when you start the game, you'll only have a couple of tech priests and only some basic troops unlocked, and just very, very basic gear. Your tech priests are your main characters, so to speak. They're your main units. You need to keep them alive. Troops are very disposable. You summon them in as needed, but you only have access to a limited amount per mission depending on how many you brought along. Bringing along the good ones costs Blackstone. Ranking up your tech priests also costs Blackstone. The troops themselves can be upgraded as a mission reward, so they have 3 levels of upgrades they can reach, and that's all preset. You get that just by completing missions. However, how many tech priests as well as units you can bring along to a mission is also bound to your unit slots, which is pretty limited at the beginning, and as you complete missions, you can unlock more and more. Now you start the game with 2 tech priests. You can have potentially up to 6, and unless you have permadeath on, they will get resurrected and healed at the end of every mission. Whereas the troops fill a very specific role and do only 1 or 2 things, tech priests are very customizable. You'll be spending Blackstone, your main resource, to upgrade them and rank them up, which will increase the amount of augments you can put on them, as well as allow them to specialize in one of a variety of skill trees. Ranking them up through these skill trees will provide you with new equipment for them, which will increase their health, their armor, as well as other various attributes which allows them to specialize in a type of combat, say ranged, melee, etc. That said though, you can keep ranking these up until you have several trees maxed out, though it does get more and more expensive, so around 1 or 2 trees is usually the sweet spot, though you can keep going on one particular tech priest if you want. And some of these trees do synergize pretty well together, but honestly, once you get towards rank 15 to 20, that tech priest is so much stronger than anything you're going to fight, it really doesn't matter much. But as you're moving through the game, completing missions, one of the other things you'll get is access to various bits of gear, types of weapons, weapon upgrades. Each weapon typically also has 3 upgrade levels, so you'll get a power axe 1, 2, and 3 for instance. And that's important because each rank takes up more augment slots, again 1 to 3 slots potentially, so using the good stuff will require you to rank up your tech priest quite a bit. But you'll definitely want to do that because this game uses a flat damage reduction system via armor, which we'll talk about in the combat section. But just know you want to rank these guys up so you can use better and better equipment as the best stuff gets ridiculous. And then the other form of progression is your cognition, how much of it you can have, as cognition is like your primary battle resource, which altogether brings us to the actual combat system. So combats take place pretty regularly, as you might imagine, as this is a TRPG, but as you move through the rooms of a mission, you might run into optional encounters or the required amount for the mission itself, and this will drop you into a map against Necrons, and right away, how much cognition you have matters. Because your battle will always start with the tech priests you have, but if you want to bring in extra troops, you have to spend cognition to do so. You gain cognition either through the narrative events and missions, collecting it from the environment, or killing enemies. Managing the cognition system is everything for combat, and once you get good at that, combat itself becomes pretty easy. But just by moving through the game, it becomes incredibly easy to manage, as some of the skill trees will just give you abilities that immediately replenish all of your cognition. Each tech priest you have also has a servitor which can go gather cognition from environmental effects. One of the trees actually allows you to gather all of the cognition from a source, which can be around 3, as opposed to just the 1 you'll get normally. But in addition to being used to summon troops, cognition is also used to use your better weapons, as the good weapons, the strong stuff, requires cognition to activate. You do get a few weapons that will typically allow you to do a little bit of damage for free, but your big abilities use this resource system, and how much resource they use depends on the weapons you have equipped. Melee as well as beam weapons tend to be the best way to go, as most of the Necrons are in ranged. And this being a turn-based tactical game, they don't get to make ranged attacks if you are standing right next to them, neither do you. Meaning that if you stand next to a ranged unit, it has to move away from you to attack, and if your character has a melee weapon, that triggers an attack of opportunity. And just that simple fact and knowing how to abuse it can make melee very, very strong. But also you have beam weapons. Some of the later weapons will fire in a line through enemies or do damage to enemies in an area. This is incredibly strong, as these weapons tend to do very high damage and can start wiping people out. Which I tell you because once you get a feel for how these systems play together, the combat gets very, very easy, which is both a consequence of you learning how to approach the combat, but also the combat being structured in a way that allows for it, which brings me to my other point about combat, which is some of the more interesting systems and how they approach them. In this particular TRPG, we don't really deal with hit chance at all. If you attack an enemy, it will hit them. It might not deal any damage though due to the armor systems. Armor is flat reduction in this game. So if I have 3 armor for say melee and I get hit with a melee attack, I will reduce 3 of that damage. And this is what makes upgrading your weapons so important, because this works both ways for you and enemies. However, the more you use one weapon in combat, you might charge its machine spirit. Machine spirit is a powered up attack that provides an extra effect, which sometimes can remove armor from an enemy, making them easier to hit, which combined with some of the other things I mentioned earlier can make for some devastating attacks. There are the occasional abilities that will provide you a dodge chance, but for the most part, no hit chance. You just have to deal with this damage reduction system. And when you combine a lot of these systems together, you're left with a combat system that feels overall relatively easy to learn with a decent skill ceiling, especially once you start learning how to manage the cognition system, as well as some best practices in dealing with enemies, like running up on them if that character has a melee weapon, because you know that ranged character is going to have to move away from you to trigger an opportunity attack, things like that. You learn as you go. You don't have to deal with frustrating things like missing on, say, a 95% chance to hit, that type of stuff. And to me, this combat collectively makes for a game that feels like it respects your time while still being fun to learn and engage with, as opposed to other game systems who have much more complicated layers that don't necessarily add much. But basically my point here is that Mechanicus does combat very well with a minimal amount of systems. Though if I had to give it one nitpick, only fighting Necrons does get a little stale after a while, though they do provide you with a lot of different types of Necrons to fight, so I suppose that's something. Now, one last thing before we start moving to wrap this up a little bit is that the game does an excellent job with presentation. So one thing you'll hear a lot about this game is how amazing its soundtrack is, but really I think the sound design for this game overall is very, very well done. So your characters, the Adeptus Mechanicus, will often speak in just like robotic sounds. There's not really words per se. You'll read words, of course, but that's not what you'll hear. But then when you're fighting Necrons and they occasionally speak, they actually use English, which in a weird way makes them feel slightly more human than your own characters, who are slowly turning themselves to machines for the sake of the Omnissiah. So the sound design just overall for this game is very, very well done. There's a lot of just little things about it that are great. And then the other side of this is that this is a fantastic game to learn more about the Adeptus Mechanicus in particular. You certainly won't learn everything by any means, but if you want to get a feel for what that particular faction is all about, this game is definitely a great place to do that, because you'll learn a lot of the core concepts about them, with some of them even being explored and checked out a little bit. Now that brings us to our Steam Deck compatibility, and honestly I don't have a ton to say here outside of it runs great. It has a verified on deck rating, which I think absolutely holds up, but most TRPGs in general run very well on the Steam Deck because the format for that genre works very, very well here. And if I had to give a little bit of a nitpick, it can be sometimes a little annoying trying to pick exactly where you want to put your character, but that's about it. Beyond that, it works great on Steam Deck, and there's not much else to say. And that brings us to our positives and negatives, then we'll draw a conclusion. So, on the positive side of things, this is a nice focused experience. Most TRPGs can be very, very long. This one's maybe 15 to 20 hours for a playthrough, and that combined with the difficulty options makes this very beginner friendly, while still leaving enough of a skill ceiling for people who are used to these types of games to have something to enjoy as well, which I think combined with all of the great quality of life stuff can make for a very fun experience for a lot of people. And as I mentioned earlier, it does have a great soundtrack, a lot of great design, which you'll hear people praise very, very often. Now on the negative side of things, I do still have a few points to make here though, and that is primarily that despite the short runtime, there's still a lot of repetition, which isn't uncommon for TRPGs by any means, but you're only going to be fighting Necrons, and once you've figured out the combat, you've pretty much figured it out. The game's really not going to throw any curveballs at you. There's a few new units that come up as you play the game, but as a consequence of that focused experience I mentioned, it does certainly get repetitive after a while. Another negative is that the story of this game is very what you see is what you get. The DLC added a little more for sure, but the base story is basically Necrons are waking up and we gotta stop it, and that is all the story you're gonna get. There's no real twists or turns, nothing in terms of story development. That one simple sentence basically sums up the entirety of the story, with the only real variation being in the endings, which are decided by which missions you completed first. And last on the negative side is that the difficulty curve is just off. The game is incredibly challenging in the beginning, and then it just fades into nothing towards the end of the game, which as a result can make it feel pretty unbalanced. And while I do think this is a great TRPG for newcomers, because I think dealing with that initial challenge and overcoming it will go a long way for them, especially when combined with all the other parts of this game, still doesn't change the fact that there just really isn't a challenge in the end game at all, which makes the difficulty curve of the game just feel very off to me, as all the difficult stuff is very front-loaded. But that brings us to our conclusion. Ultimately, I think all of that stuff said, this is a great TRPG. You can find it full price for about $30 US, though it is a few years old and thus is regularly on sale. You can buy it right now on sale for like $7. And overall, I'd say it's a very good TRPG. You can learn more about the Adeptus Mechanicus, Necrons, TRPGs in general, It has a ton of quality of life stuff that I'd love to see in a lot of other TRPGs, great sound design, and while the game certainly does have a few negatives, they are definitely vastly outweighed by everything that this game does exceptionally well, and most importantly, it's easy to learn, fun to play, and a great time. So naturally, it definitely gets a buy from me. You should check this one out, especially if you love this genre, as I think even the pillars of this type of game could really stand to learn a few things from Mechanicus. But that is all I've got for you guys. I certainly hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. But regardless of any of that, truly, thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. Given the timing of this video, I certainly hope everyone watching had a fantastic Christmas. I know I certainly did, which is in large part thanks to you, the people watching these videos. So thank you. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.